So most of us, if not all of us, we can probably think of a time in our life where we had an interaction with someone or a conversation with someone that simply did not go well. And of course, we look back on that and it was always the fault of the other person, because it's never our fault. But these people, right, they come at you guns a-blazing, and you are immediately on the defensive. And so you clap back with the same fire and fury that they came at you with. And I know for me, I've had interactions like that. I can specifically remember a phone call where the person on the other end of the line, they got the best of me. And the call was with someone that I really didn't know all that well. The person virtually knew nothing about me. I knew very little about them. But regardless, this person got my number, and they were sending me messages every day over the course of several days. And they weren't nice text messages, no good mornings, no how are yous. They were insults. And I was being accused of things that I didn't do. And I would say even worse than that, my family, people that I love, they were being insulted and they were being accused of things that I didn't do. Now I'm thankful that with these text messages I had self-control. I just didn't respond. Dozens and dozens of messages, but I knew that engaging would get me nowhere. But again, for days, this person is sending me these horrible text messages, and then there was one night that this person ended up calling me. I shouldn't have taken the bait, but I did. I picked up the phone, and their goal was the same. Their tone was the same. They continued to say these horrible things to me and about people that I loved, and I just couldn't take it anymore. I raised my voice. I refuted their claims, and I honestly just insulted them back. And obviously, as we all know, this didn't make anything better. It only made things worse. And as I was giving it back to them, they were getting even more upset. They're yelling over me. I'm yelling over them. The conversation goes nowhere. I end up hitting them with one last insult that I thought was pretty good. Then I hung up. And this whole phone call is happening while my wife Kate's just making dinner. And so after the call, get dinner ready. We sit down at the table. I calmed down. But I reflected on that moment, I reflected on the phone call, and I recognized that I had lost my self-control. I'm a middle school teacher, as many of you guys know, and a few years ago they did this thing with the students. Describe your teacher with one word, and the one word that I got from most of the students was chill. Mr. Murphy's a chill guy. So I very rarely get angry. I don't express it outwardly, but in this moment, I got to a place of anger that I very rarely go. And I said things to another person that I never usually would. And honestly, as I sat there at dinner after that phone call, I was just embarrassed about how I responded. And so we prayed before we started eating, and in that prayer, as we're saying grace before the meal, I repented. I said, God, if there was anything sinful, and I know there was, in that conversation, I pray that you'd forgive me. And as hard as it was, I prayed that that person on the other line, I don't know what this person needed, but God, I pray that you'd touch their hearts. And so we finished up our meal. It was pasta. It was delicious. But then that person calls me a second time. The first phone call, it went nowhere, and it probably lasted no more than 5 minutes. But this second phone call, I had calmed down, I had prayed, and I was able to be more intentional. In that phone call, it lasted a half hour. Not because we were yelling back and forth. The person I was speaking with, they continued to insult me and make accusations toward me and speak ill of my family members. They got furious over the course of that call for a few times, but because I was going into the phone call much more calm, they were disarmed and the situation gradually de-escalated. So I wouldn't say that second call really went anywhere either. Not much progress was made. I can't say any problems were solved, but it definitely went better. So there was 2 different conversations, 2 different approaches, with two different results. In the first, I was addressed with fury, and I responded with fury. And the results were an explosion where I lost my temper and I made a fool of myself. And the second, the other point here is that neither one of us were heard, no progress was made, and then there was this second, much different phone call. I again was addressed with fury, but this time, after a moment of reflection, prayer, talking about it with my wife, I instead was able to respond, instead with fury, with wisdom. And I remained calm, and I remained in control of the conversation. I was able to hear them, and they were probably able to hear me. But fighting fire with fire, it didn't work here. Fighting fury with fury, it didn't work. And after those two phone calls, I had learned this importance of fighting fury with wisdom. And we've all probably had to deal with that person on the other end of the phone. It might not have been a phone call, but it's this type of person who in that moment would be described as angry. Might be described as outraged, enraged, infuriated, angered, ballistic, whatever word we want to go with. You know what I'm talking about. We've all had to deal with such a person. It might have been a situation at work. I know for me, I've worked several retail jobs over the course of my life. I've worked at a candy store, a frozen yogurt shop. I've worked at Market Basket as a meat clerk. I've worked at Lowe's. I've worked at a bookstore. And I can think of multiple instances from each of those jobs where there were a customer that came up to me just furious. For whatever reason, they were furious and they decided to take it out on me. You might have the type of job where your entire day is spent helping and serving other people. And I'm sure it gets under your skin when you've helped this person out and then they come to you complaining and furious and upset at you for whatever reason it might be. You might have the type of job where you're more so working on projects and plans for other people. You've got clients, and you've got clients that just give you the hardest time. We deal with these type of people online. I think that's where we see it the most. It's amazing to see this courage that people get when they're interacting with another person behind a screen. They've got this power to say things that they probably would never say if the conversation was in person. Years ago, people had diaries and journals. Nowadays, people have Facebook. And they take every thought they have and they share it with the world. When they've got an opinion, they share it with everyone they know. When something makes them sad, they communicate it with everyone. And like with what we're talking about, something has upset them. And they hop online and they rattle it off and they spar with anyone willing to take the bait. People out in public. This doesn't happen too often, but it does happen. We come across people who are just looking for a fight. Anyone. People that are just looking for a punching bag. As we drive, I feel like we see this quite a bit on the road. Call it road rage. We have shopping carts as we do our grocery shopping for the week. We might bump into the wrong person and they just give us an earful. Maybe you're out to eat. You might be on vacation. You might be at the movies. You're having a pleasant time and you've just come across someone who wants to make that time a little bit less pleasant. And then the hardest thing is when we have to deal with fury in our own family. I once heard the analogy of people being like porcupines. The closer they get to one another, the more they start to hurt each other. And for most people, no one's closer than family. A lot of times siblings deal with this as children and as adults. Definitely there's these types of tensions with children and parents as when they are children and then even when they grow up to be adults. In a marriage, a husband gets mad at a wife gets mad at a husband, or husband and wife are both mad at each other and nobody wins. I'm not suggesting that someone else is always the angry person. God knows, if we're being honest, each and every one of us has been the angry person before. But what I want us to do this morning is recognize that this is something that we will face. This is something that we've all faced, will continue to face. And I almost feel like in our world today, we see this type of mentality more and more. There's just so much more fury. in people than there used to be. But when we come across such a person, when we find ourselves in that type of a moment, as God's people, how are we supposed to engage? If God doesn't want his people fighting fury with fury, what are we supposed to do? How do we combat ourselves when we're under such an attack? I've mentioned before that the Bible is full of examples of people doing the right thing, examples of people doing the wrong thing. And Daniel, he's one of these rare figures in the Bible where it seems, he's not perfect, but it seems like he always does make the right decision, and he's a good example for us to look at. Our passage today is going to be Daniel chapter 2, and we're going to be reading verses 1 through 18 together this morning. If you've got your Bible, I encourage you to turn there with me. If you've got an app on your phone, that'll work too. If not, the verses will be up on the screen. We're going to tackle this passage verse by verse, but before we do, I do want to provide a little bit of context. On the timeline of God's people, the events of Daniel take place between 550, 600 years prior to the times of Jesus. So we're looking at around 600 BC, and God's people, the Israelites, specifically the southern kingdom of Judah, they have been invaded by a wicked nation called Babylon, and this attack was led by their king, Nebuchadnezzar. And part of the Babylonian invasion of Judah, it included taking a portion of the Judah population and bringing them as exiles into Babylon. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he made this specific request that the best of the best, the brightest young men from Judah be brought to the palace, be trained and educated so potentially they could be of great use to him in the personal service there for the king in the palace. And on top of already being described by the Bible this way, without defect, good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, we have Daniel, who was one of those exiles. We have his 3 friends, who were also exiles. They're brought to the palace to get ready to serve the king. God ends up giving them more knowledge and intelligence. And because they were so smart, they stood out. They were seen as being far more capable than all of the other exiles, all of the other young men that were in this training program. And so Nebuchadnezzar ends up elevating them to a position where they were serving in the king's personal service. And I think those would be the most important details in getting us started for the passage that we're about to walk through. To summarize, we have Daniel and his 3 friends who are serving in an advisory type position to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Let's go ahead and read the first verse. We'll actually do verses 1 through 3. Daniel chapter 2, and it says this. Now in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream. So King Nebuchadnezzar, he seems to have what we'd recognize as a nightmare, maybe something a little bit more intense than a standard nightmare, but he's having a dream that's causing him so much trouble, that is so bothersome to him, that he's losing sleep over it. And whatever this dream was, and we don't know it at this point in Daniel chapter 2, but later on in the chapter we're going to be able to read and see exactly what the dream was. The king knew, despite not knowing what it meant, he knew that it was significant. He knew that it had a meaning, and it was going to be critical for him to know what it meant. So he calls upon his advisors. And the advisors he calls upon, the Bible says that they're magicians, they're conjurers, they're sorcerers and Chaldeans. And he wants them to do what they claim to be able to do, which is access the supernatural and consult whatever lowercase g gods they serve. And he wants them to get an interpretation ASAP. Let's do verses 4 through 6. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, "O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation." The king replied to the Chaldeans, "The command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a rubbish heap. But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts and a reward and great honor. Therefore declare to me the dream and its interpretation." So the king's advisors, they hear this instruction from the king. And they understand the assignment. They say, "Absolutely, king, you tell us what the dream was, and we will give you an interpretation." But King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to be certain that the interpretation they were giving him was true. He wanted verification. He wanted to know that the higher power that these magicians and conjurers and sorcerers were consulting were the real deal. So he didn't just want the interpretation. He hadn't told them what the dream was yet, so he wanted them to also provide the contents of the dream. That was the verification he was looking for. Nebuchadnezzar says that if they're able to meet this demand, if they're not able to meet this demand, he's going to have them killed, they're going to be torn limb from limb, and their homes are going to be destroyed as well. If they are able to meet this demand, they're going to receive from the king gifts, reward, and great honor. Basically, Nebuchadnezzar is saying, "Do this for me and I will treat you well. If you don't, I will destroy you." We kind of would look at that as being pretty toxic. We read verses 7, 8, and 9. They answered a second time and said, "Let the king tell the dream to his servants, and we will declare the interpretation." The king replied, "I know for certain that you are bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen that the command from me is firm, that if you do not make the dream known for me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. Therefore tell me the dream, that I may know that you can declare to me its interpretation." The conversation between Nebuchadnezzar and his advisors is going back and forth. It's a little bit of an argument. After sharing this stipulation of not just giving the interpretation, but also the dream itself, they again ask for the dream because they want to give him some type of interpretation. But King Nebuchadnezzar, he calls them out for stalling. He's kind of picking up on the fact that his advisors, these magicians, conjurers, and sorcerers, they're not able to do or present what he's asking for. He believes that they're getting ready to give him a false interpretation. If he can tell them the dream, they're just going to tell him an interpretation so that they can be out of this situation. Their life is no longer on the line. Let's read verses 10 and 11. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there is no one else who could declare it to the king except God's, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh." And so the advisors, they press forward. They continue in their effort to either get the king to share with them his dream or to convince him that what he's asking for is impossible. They say there's not a man on earth who could do it. They say that there's no great king or ruler who has ever asked their advisors for anything like this. And they say that only gods themselves could pull off something supernatural like this. And in verses 12 through 13, we see how Nebuchadnezzar feels about this. It says, "Because of this, the king became indignant and very furious, and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them." So his advisors, they couldn't meet the request that Nebuchadnezzar made of them. They were unable to provide the interpretation of the dream. They were even more so unable to provide the dream's contents itself. And it says that Nebuchadnezzar became indignant and very furious. to the point that he calls for his advisors and anyone in Babylon that would fall under the category of wise man to be found and to be killed. And if you remember, having proven themselves to be the very top of their class, to be the very best out of all the exiles and all the other young men in their program, Daniel and his 3 friends, they were advisors to the king. They were in his personal service. They would be categorized as wise men, and so they were on the hit list. Nebuchadnezzar wanted them killed too. And there's 2 adjectives here that describe how Nebuchadnezzar is feeling as a result. We get these 2 adjectives that give us the reason. Why is Nebuchadnezzar lashing out with this extreme violence, calling for all the wise men to be killed? I'm using the 1995 edition of the New American Standard Bible, and as we already read, the 2 words were indignant and furious. The NIV says angry and furious. Christian Standard Bible says violently angry. Good News Translation says that the king flew into a rage. The Message says that that set the king off. He lost his temper. And we get the idea. Obviously, Nebuchadnezzar's actions, they're unrelatable. However, the emotions that are behind his actions, we've experienced them ourselves, as we've already said, but we see it all the time. Furious and indignant. And in the last portion of our passage, verses 14 through 18, we see how Daniel responds to Nebuchadnezzar's fury. We'll start with verse 14. It says, "Then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon." Arioch, he was apparently one of the king's high-ranking military-type men, and he was the one who was given the orders to go out and kill all the wise men of Babylon. And in this moment, he's specifically looking for Daniel and his friends. And it says that Daniel approaches Arioch with discretion and discernment. Discretion is defined this way: the quality of having or showing good judgment, or the ability to make responsible decisions. Discernment is the quality of being able to comprehend what is obscure. Wisdom would be a word that is synonymous with both of those things, especially discretion. And despite Arioch being a man who had been sent to kill Daniel and his friends on behalf of Nebuchadnezzar's fury, here we have Daniel, who does not meet Arioch with that same rage and fury. He doesn't lose his temper. He doesn't lose his self-control. It says that Daniel responds essentially with wisdom. Not just here in this initial encounter, but every step that Daniel takes after this moment, Daniel responds to Nebuchadnezzar's fury with wisdom. Verse 15. He said to Arioch, the king's commander, "For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent?" Then Arioch informed Daniel about this matter. So Daniel seeks further clarification. His desire is to understand why Nebuchadnezzar has called for this action to be taken. What has led Nebuchadnezzar to get so furious to this point that he's having an entire population of their country slain? What is the reason? Daniel seeks understanding. Verse 16 says this: "So Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king." We remember that Daniel was part of the king's personal service. He lived there in the palace with him, I'm sure, or spent a lot of time there. And so he had a level of access with Nebuchadnezzar that most people probably didn't. Verse 16 tells us that he goes to the king and he asks for time because he believes that he can give him the dream and the interpretation. And it's not because Daniel thinks he's better than all of the sorcerers and conjurers and all the other wise men who failed and were unable to do this. But as we see all throughout the book of Daniel, as we see established by the end of chapter 1, Daniel's a man of God. He fully relies on God. And he believes that if he has time, as he requests from Nebuchadnezzar, he'll be able to get that interpretation for him. And he asks for time because if you've ever prayed a prayer, you've asked God for an answer, you've asked God for something, it's not always immediate. Sometimes it takes time, and Daniel, being a man of prayer, knew that. And that's why he asks Nebuchadnezzar for time. He wants enough time to be able to get that interpretation from God, because he believes that God can use Daniel to do this. He trusts that God can do it through him. Verse 17. Then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, about the matter. And this verse tells us that Daniel goes to his three friends, and he tells them what's going on. He tells them that he's been granted time. They're going to seek God and see if they can get this interpretation and dream from them. And I might be taking a creative liberty on this part. I know that it's Daniel communicating with his friends, but I like this idea of Daniel facing fury. And part of responding in wisdom is going to the people in his life who are godly and mature and can help him figure this out. Verse 18, final verse of this passage, so that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Daniel and his friends, it's not that they think they can figure it out. It's not that they think that they're better than their peers. It's not them that's going to do this. The Bible says that they request compassion from the God of heaven. If Nebuchadnezzar's demands are not met, Daniel, his three friends, and all of the wise men in Babylon are going to be killed. And they're asking that God would see this situation, that he would have compassion on them, and that he would allow Daniel to be used to give King Nebuchadnezzar the dream and the interpretation that he's been asking for. King Nebuchadnezzar, as we read, he lashes out in anger. All of the wise men in Babylon, Daniel's friend, Daniel himself, are the victims. They are at the receiving end of Nebuchadnezzar's fury. But Daniel does not fight fury with fury. As we read, Daniel prays. Daniel speaks with his friends, consults the godly people in his life. Daniel seeks further understanding as to what's happening. And Daniel speaks with discretion and discernment. Daniel fights fury with wisdom. And if we were to take that, this idea of fighting fury with wisdom, we can kind of get an idea of how it would play out in our life. You're at work and you've got a customer or a client or a patient who, for whatever reason, is furious. They're speaking to you in such a tone and in such a way that you would feel absolutely justified in telling them what's what. But God doesn't want us fighting fury with fury. He wants us fighting fury with wisdom. Let's do as Daniel did and speak with that discretion. Speak with discernment. For those of you who spend a good deal of time on social media, you're scrolling through Facebook or Instagram or whatever it is, and you come across, it might be a random person, it might be a family member, it might be someone that you went to high school with decades ago, but they are vehemently opposing something that you believe. And your instinct is to go right to the comment section and destroy them. But again, God doesn't want us fighting fury with fury. He wants us to fight fury with wisdom. And so part of this might be seeking further understanding. Why does this make them so mad? And in the case of social media, I would probably just say this: it's not worth it at all. It's a very fruitless place. There's no real conversations that are happening there, especially when people are angry. You're out and about, you're running errands, you're looking to have a good day, but you've bumped into someone that wants you to have as bad a day as they're having. And again, God doesn't want us fighting fury with fury. He wants us fighting fury with wisdom. Let's seek the counsel from the godly people in our lives. Let's talk it through with folks and in our family. When things arise, as they inevitably do, certainly we don't want to fight fury with the people that we're supposed to love the most. We want to fight that fury with wisdom, so let's do as Daniel did and bring it before the Lord in prayer. Worship team, if you guys can join me up front, we're going to bring this service to a close. As we fight fury with wisdom as a church, it's important for us to remember that there is a person, a child of God, someone created in the image of God behind that fury. Again, I know this message was specifically about us and how we navigate and deal with those who are blinded with fury and they're lashing out in anger. We've established already that sometimes that's us. That's been us before. If we look at Nebuchadnezzar, he's definitely the villain of this story. He called for all the wise men in his country to be killed. But if we were to rewind Daniel chapter 2 all the way to the first couple of verses, we would be reminded that Nebuchadnezzar is a man who's having a dream so bad that it's tormenting him. He's losing sleep over it. In the first verse says that his spirit was troubled. Nebuchadnezzar had a spiritual issue on his hand. And for those of us who call Jesus Christ Savior and Lord of our life, we know that when we have a spiritual issue, we take it to God. We take it to Jesus. Nebuchadnezzar, he didn't know that. Or he didn't do that. He took his spiritual issue and he went to conjurers. He went to magicians. He went to sorcerers. And so first and foremost, I think what Nebuchadnezzar is a person who's spiritually lost. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12 says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places." We see these people who lash out and they address us with fury. And in the moment, it might be hard to see them as anything less than how they're treating you. But let's keep in mind that they've got a spiritual issue here. An important part of fighting fury with wisdom is going before God in prayer and praying for those who are blind with rage. Proverbs is one of the Bible's books of wisdom, and all throughout it, this issue is addressed. Proverbs 15:1, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." Proverbs 15:18, "A hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but the slow to anger calms a dispute." Proverbs 19:11, "A fool always loses a temper, but a wise man holds it back." I think about that story that I shared in the beginning. 2 phone calls. One where I fought fury with fury. I lost my temper and I made a fool of myself. The second one, I'd calmed down, talked it over with my wife, prayed about it, and I was in control. As Proverbs says right here, I was able to hold it back, and I think we saw Daniel do that too. Just as we read so clearly stated in the book of Proverbs, just as we saw modeled so greatly for us by Daniel in his own book, fighting fury with fury, it gets us nowhere. And so in a world like ours, as God's people, we're called to fight fury with wisdom. So let's fight fury with wisdom. Let's do just that. Guys, I'm going to invite you to stand, and we are going to worship our God together before we go.